Welcome, everyone, to the stream this afternoon. This interview is brought to you by Terra Firma Teaching Alliance at tfteach.org. We are a nationwide network of teachers working to uphold standards and maintain impartial academic quality, despite considerable pressure to yield to political pressure within the field of education, which is largely dominated by a particular strain of progressivism. Our motto is pedagogy, not ideology, and we organize to push back and to restore intellectual balance to the K-12 classroom. To that end, we offer a number of resources for like-minded educators, including twice-weekly support and discussion meetings, enriched professional development, which we offer as an antidote to the endless so-called teacher training teachers are subjected to, as well as a substack featuring original narratives and insights of active K-12 educators. We also offer recruitment and placement assistance to both teachers and schools. We know that there is a very mobilized movement of frustrated parents, but there are also many frustrated teachers and simultaneously an enormous growing teacher shortage. There is no way to rectify the problems in K-12 education without cultivating a pool of the kinds of teachers our listeners would like their children to have, and we're speaking to one tonight. Allow me to introduce our guest, known as Dissident Teacher, who as a member of our network is one of those teachers we need. Welcome, Dissident Teacher. It's so nice to have you with us tonight.
Hi, Paul. Thank you for inviting me.
Tell us, what's your experience as a teacher? Where have you taught, and where how are things going now?
So I've taught. This is my 21st year of teaching. I have taught. My background is in English, but I am a social studies teacher. I am highly qualified according to the state of California. I have a national board certification in social studies and a master's degree in my content area, literature. I taught for 13 of my 20 years in very low performing, very high need, high poverty schools, mostly among Chicano students. I'm also Chicana. And I went, after sort of burning out, working as hard as I did, as hard as the system makes you work when you're dealing with kids who need a lot of help, I switched over for my family's sake to a quote unquote distinguished school in California, so very high test scoring school, high scores, high college enrollment, high graduation, all the quote unquote good things, and quickly realized within the first 2 years of teaching the most privileged kids in the nation that it was just as bad as the first 13 years of my career, because it's the system, it's not the kids. It's many things, but it is not the kids. So I'm here today just to talk about that and let parents know what's up, and hopefully we can help some teachers find a way to whatever extent we can, do what's right for kids, and in contravention of what the system incentivizes us to do.
That's really, thanks, and we'll get into all this. So over the course of your 20 years, how have the institutions changed? Like what have you seen? Have there been pressure from administration, colleagues? Can you sort of give us a sense of what's been the transition here?
Well, one of the cool things about being a teacher, and I think a lot of teachers love this, and this is how we sort of rationalize staying in the profession, is that we have a lot of control when we close the door in our room. So, I mean, as a parent, you could see that as a good or a bad thing. But if you feel like your heart's in the right place, the ability to close the door means there's really no pressure on you. If admin isn't walking into your room, if they're not after you, it's really not a big deal to be a teacher, and there's not a lot of pressure. But what happened is, really around 2013, 2014, the standards sort of went out the window for academic standards for students, and then attendantly behavioral standards just dropped, and there was zero support from admin. We started to see that pretty quickly. And so what I would say is the only pressure has been to help, quote unquote help, I say quote unquote a lot, I should probably stop doing that, to help more students succeed. Now, how a teacher sees the word succeed versus how an administrator sees the word succeed can be incredibly different definitions. They're incredibly different definitions. And I'm kind of an old school, school marmy, bun in the hair, sort of listen to me and do what I say kind of teacher, with a lot of warmth too. But, my point of that was just to say that I run a strict classroom, so my kids tended to be okay, and we tended to do well. But you could see the deterioration around you in the school, and I would hear it from my colleagues.
Hmm. And so, how the administrator, you mentioned how the administrator defines success, how the teacher defines success. Very different, right?
100% graduation rate.
Okay.
The only thing that mattered was grad rate. And one of the things, and there were so many ways, and I probably shouldn't bring this up, but I'll just say there were many very dirty, nasty subterfuges in order to ensure that kids were graduating. The easiest one is just to tell teachers, I had many colleagues say this to me because I was constantly butting heads and constantly on the radar with like high levels of kids getting F's at quarterly report, right? And usually my kids would save themselves because they realized I wasn't going to save them, so they'd figure it out. But I would have colleagues say, why don't you just give them a D? Like, it's no skin off your nose. Just give them the D or give them whatever. And if you have a particularly angry parent, give them the B. Who cares? Whatever, the kid's not going to succeed anyway. And that's the kind of rationalization that we hear. And then admin's never going to push back. So you can just get away with that all day long if you want to. And I don't think most teachers necessarily do that, but the pressure is there and it's real. And even if it's never outright clearly stated, just give everyone a D, you hear it a lot. And it's just simple. It's the path of least resistance. And so most people will take the path of least resistance.
So a teacher who cares, a teacher that really wants the student to learn, is looking into what they can do. What's actually in front of her or him. And then you have, would you say that, or do you think?
I'm sorry, I interrupted you before you really finished.
No, it's okay. I was going to say, drawing my own experience, you have an idea of your mission as a teacher, which is to teach the children to learn and know. And then you have this administrative apparatus that has a certain idea of success, and that, and then other teachers that are just, maybe they're burnt out, maybe they're discouraged, maybe they've just seen too much and they want to, get, like you said, path of least resistance. So you're in this environment. How do you cope with this? How do you manage to keep your integrity?
Well, I joke about this, but basically I have oppositional defiance disorder. So, like, if someone tells me to do something, I'm not going to do it. Like, it's almost pathological at this point. But when something comes from admin, I almost immediately discard it. And I don't think I'm alone in saying that as a veteran teacher. It's just like, oh, yeah, they're telling me this year, and next year it's going to be something different. So I'm just going to do what works. Now, the problem is define what works. Is what works what minimizes my workload? Is what works what gives me the best quality of life? Or is what works what is best for the students in my room every year? And, that's a difficult question, because when you talk about the system allows for any definition of what works. And I feel like for a lot of teachers, what works is, again, the path of least resistance. So how can I make my life better? And I understand that desire to go to the path of least resistance, because the job is impossible. And it is so discouraging on so many levels that to say this is what we want, or this is what I'm going to do, and try to get everyone in the same boat. Again, that closed door then becomes a problem, because you can have teachers say, oh yes, I'm going to do this, and I'm always going to look out for what's best for the kids. But when they close their door, do you really know that that's what's happening? As a parent, as a teacher, it's kind of none of my business. That's an admin problem. But it ends up being my problem when the kids come to my room and I have expectations that they know and can do certain things, and they can't. Yeah, and my curriculum depends upon them being able to do certain things at a certain level in a certain time frame, and that's impossible. And that's how you sort of have this, like, these stacks that just keeps stacking up, these negative. So you just get going farther and farther backwards, and yet the kids are being socially promoted forwards. And so basically we're living a gigantic lie. And that is where I think most teachers' stress levels, why they're so high, is there's enormous cognitive dissonance in this profession between what I think I'm here to do and what I am incentivized and pressured to do on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, and I've seen this in my own among my colleagues at my former job. There's a teacher, a math teacher, very good, good teacher in my department, but he had this PR spiel he would give for the administration that he was, constructivist and inquiry driven, and he had the kids do all these creative things. And then when in his classroom, he just taught, very direct, explicit, boom, boom, boom. And I was like, how, and he himself couldn't even admit it to himself. It was very strange. He had to sort of keep up this act. And it's like you got to be dancing, living a double life. It's very strange. Now, one thing we've talked about is, this pressure to not put pressure on the kids. How does that play out?
Well, it's simple that we just keep going away from anything like any calibrated standard of success or achievement. It's all, well, you do you in the classroom. Now, I am in California, so I'm probably the furthest down the road into this kind of educational, I don't even know what to call it, miasma. I don't know, just this disastrous, toxic cloud of nothingness where everyone just does their own thing. I mean, it seems really, and it's a little bit, we have that kind of hippy-dippy heritage over here. But what we see is our reading scores and our math scores are just absolutely in the toilet. Like, it's embarrassing given how much wealth is in this state that our students are not being held accountable for anything, even remotely resembling achievement. So I think what's happened is, California is quote unquote an innovator. I did quote unquote again. Let's count my quote unquote. Let's make that a drinking game, guys. It's
right.
6:30. Go for it. But that California is an innovative state, and so it's whatever new thing pops up, go for it. Oh, and we're gonna have a PD on it, right? Like, we're gonna sit in professional development, and we're gonna talk about this thing, and it's gonna sound amazing. And then you're gonna have to experiment in your classroom to figure out how this works. Now, I have literally bought into everything. When I say bought into, I mean that like actually, literally, like I will buy the book. And I will read the book, and I will go, okay, let me implement the practices. I've done the question formulation technique. I've done inquiry-based learning. I've done project-based learning. I've followed all the gurus. I've read all the blogs. And I'm like, okay, this could work if I had 5 students.
Right.
Right? And I was able to differentiate and individualize and all the resources and time at my fingertips to ensure that those 5 kids had an excellent experience. But I have 40.
Yeah.
And so throwing all this stuff at the wall to try to see if it sticks when we have, and nobody likes them, these traditional, more tried and true methods of instruction where the teacher is the expert. And, this assumes teachers are experts, which is a whole other problem, experts in their content. Then, if you use that old school method, you're accused of what?
Being the sage on the stage. Yes.
Yeah. Well, then at this point, it's white supremacy, right? To have standards you're a racist. And I'm like, well, I'm the most Mexican racist I know. So, well, I guess that's a new thing, right? So anyway, that's a whole other Oprah. Anyway, but I do think that basically this inquiry-based, project-based, I like the idea. I think if it's just me and a couple of kids, amazing, wonderful, awesome work could be done. But when you put me in a room of 40 kids with vastly different skill and ability levels, not to mention literacy levels, it's unmanageable. And also it means that, some kids are not going to get any attention from me. And that's really a shame. It's very inequitable, honestly. Let's talk about, if you want to talk about
you're right.
that.
Yeah. I think you're right. So, I mean, we have other things to talk about, but I want to pursue this a little bit. You said, traditional teaching methods. Tell me what works. Tell me what does it look like in your classroom? How do you, what are the things that everyone should be doing that they're just not because of all these crazy reasons?
Well, I would like to point, I think that, I practice certain things, but my practice is all based in, I wouldn't even say experience. It's based in neuroscience, right? So I try to read what works best at different levels and why it works. And then I'm also, because I'm a history teacher, I'm interested in the history of education. So I've done a lot of digging into that. And basically what I would recommend to anyone who's watching this, I strongly recommend it, is reading, is a lady named Barbara Oakley, who has the most popular online learning course ever. And I think it's called Learning How to Learn. and she wrote a book called A Mind for Numbers, where she explains how the brain works and how you learn and how you have to study in order to learn. And once I read her book, I was like, oh, finally, truth. And this was like deep into my career. This was probably like, I don't know, 14 years into my career. And I'd always been solid. Like, I was the expert in front of the room. I'm going to explain things to you. I'm going to hold you accountable for reading. I'm going to hold you accountable. I'm going to ask you questions in class. You are going to write. I'm going to read your writing. I'm going to give you feedback on your writing, because I've mainly taught humanities, so English and history, right? So I've always done sort of the hard work, like a traditional, think 50s classroom kind of. I mean, and I've been in charge in my classroom, and I would say that my students have been very happy. But when I read Barbara Oakley's book, sort of it all came together in terms of why it's important for you to read the book, then hear the lecture, annotate the text, take notes, review it every day, practice with it every day. Ideally, practice at night, wake up in the morning, practice in the morning, review, and then have this like multiple touch points with the information. And the reason K-12, one of the reasons K-12 could work at scale if you did that, if that was your main pedagogical approach, is that you're going to have kids who have heard similar things over time. So they have so many touch points with the same information. And I think the work of E.D. Hirsch is incredibly valuable here. So E.D. Hirsch, if you guys are not familiar with him, is he wrote the Dictionary of Cultural Literacy. He's the founder of a group called Core Knowledge. CoreKnowledge.org is basically Western Civ from TK, pre-kindergarten, preschool, through, he has a program basically through like 8th grade, right? And he does these books, and it's like what your kindergartner should know, what your first grader should know. And it's the myths and the stories and the science and the history and the literature and the songs and even the idioms, even down to the idioms like, an apple a day keeps the doctor away. Like he wants people to have this vast bank of knowledge that they can draw upon. Right. So it's knowledge based. It's a foundation. And some kids, and I think this is where, we talk about why is there this achievement gap? Well, some kids are drawing from a vast bank of knowledge. Sorry, I said fast, but vast. Other kids have parents who are absent or not well educated themselves. They're doing the best they can. No shame to those parents, but they're not able to give those children the same foundation that kids from wealthier / more educated / more well-read families can. And so it's not a question of money as much as it is a question of basically stores of knowledge and how that knowledge is passed down. K-12 could have been a great equalizer in passing that knowledge down in a systemic, structured way. But instead, we've gone all airy-fairy and told everybody, just do your own thing and whatever works for you is fine.
Because it's the skills that matter, right? The skills are what's important.
Yeah, but you can't do skills without knowledge. How do you write if you don't know anything? And that was, here's a fun little anecdote for everyone. I switched from English to history when my first kid was born. And that was because teaching English, I love literature. I have a master's degree in literature from a top 10 university in this country, okay? I love it. It is my passion. Teaching it in a high school is the 7th circle of hell, okay? Because I used to have students tell me, and I lovingly call it this, so please don't, I hope no one takes offense, in my ghetto school, and that's what my kids called it. So they would say, we love your class, we love you, but we hate English, we hate literature. And I was like, how do you hate literature? I don't understand it. And it's because they didn't have the knowledge to make the content accessible. So there's a great study, and I'm terrible with and this is hilarious because I'm a history teacher, I'm terrible with remembering names and dates, which is very embarrassing to admit, but I'll admit it. Also, I'm anonymous. So take that and run with it. Anyway, I made a joke and I forgot what I was saying. I was saying, oh, yes. So when I've forgotten completely. This is what happens to you as a teacher. You tell a joke and then you're so proud of your little joke that made
something
smile.
About some experiment about knowledge. Was that?
Oh, yes.
It?
Okay,
Yeah.
there it is. So reading. Okay. And I think this is in Sold a Story too. I knew it before this. If you give a kid who plays baseball and is a terrible reader. A magazine article written at like the 10th grade, 11th grade level about baseball. Oh, it's a miracle. He can read it. What? How come Johnny, the star center fielder on his little league team who watches MLB baseball constantly, never picks up a book, but you give him this article and he understands it and he can tell you it and he can talk about it at length. What? How does that happen? He's a terrible reader. Because he knows baseball. That's how. Because he has the vocabulary. He understands the context. He can picture it in his head, right? Whereas if you give me that same article, I'm a hockey person. If you give me the baseball article, I'm like, well, this is nice, and I probably have enough vocab to understand it, but not at the level Johnny can. And that's the difference. It's not about the ability to decode words, although that is incredibly important. And the fact that we moved away from phonics is absolutely criminal in my opinion. But the important work is, first, the phonics is great. You can decode the word. And I had classrooms of kids who could decode words. They could read out loud, but they got to the bottom of the page. They had no idea what they just read. They could not put those ideas together. And that is the problem. It's not, the problem is not they can't read at all or they don't like reading. And I can tell you the number of students who would dutifully go home and do the homework. I promised I wouldn't cry. I'm going to try really hard not to cry. They would go home and they would do the reading and they would come in and say, you know, Maestra, I did the homework. I promise you I read it, but I don't understand. I can't remember any of it. I don't know what I read. I don't understand what I read. And so it was just one of those things where it's like, it's not because they're incapable. It's because they lack the knowledge they need to understand a piece of writing. And if you can give them that knowledge, and generally if we're talking about Western Civ, right, there's a canon. And there's a canon for a reason, right? Just like if I was in China, I wouldn't teach the Western canon. I would teach what was relevant to the, in Asia, what's relevant to Chinese history and Chinese culture, which I'm sure they do, which is why their reading scores are way higher than ours. So that is the issue to me. It's not an issue of our kids are stupid or they're poor or it's systemic racism. It's no, they lack the foundational knowledge. And here's the worst part about that. We could fix it. We could fix that. But for many, many reasons, we do not, and we refuse to. And to me, I joke about this on Twitter every so often. And it's not really a joke. Honestly, actually, when I say this, I mean it sincerely. My 20 years in public education, and I'm going to use this word no, it's not literal. I can't say that. I'm going to use this word as a very strong metaphor. I feel blood guilt for being part of that system because I think to a certain extent, even though I did everything to fight it, and to give kids what I knew was great for them, which was that foundational knowledge, the skill of being able to put an argument together once they understood what they were arguing about. That work that I did, that pushed my family to the brink and forced me to quit that job, resign that job. That work that I did could be done and could be easier if only we put our effort into it. And here's the thing. All that work that I did, why I was this great teacher and everyone's like, oh, she's the best and we're so happy, we're so lucky you're on our campus, and all the wonderful parents during Teacher Appreciation Week who sent in tamales and did kind, lovely little things and wrote little notes. I legitimized what the rest of the system was doing to their kids. And I'll never forget being at my last school, before the one I'm at now, which is very different, but my distinguished high school, where parents that I knew, because I lived in the community, would be like, oh, we're just hoping that our kid gets you next year. Because then the whole year will have been worth it. I'm like, how can the whole year hang on your kid winning the lottery of getting me out of the other, whatever, I don't know, there were like 4 or 5 other English teachers and 3 or 4 other history teachers. You know what I mean? Like, how, but that is what they would, like, people would say that to me, and it's horrifying to hear because no kid should have 5 hours of their day wasted for 1 good hour. That's insane.
Yeah. Well, okay, let's. There's a lot to be angry about. How do we get here? How do we get away from knowledge? I mean, it's so God obvious. Knowledge is important. How do we get away from this to create those touch points for all the things that people think they can substitute for it, like skills, when you need to have the knowledge to get the skills? How do we get here? Is it when did it start to go wrong? I mean, to the best of your...
This is a difficult to trace this. There's so many competing problems. I personally think, this is where I get outed as an elitist, right? Like, I personally think that when the state pays for something, you're going to get whoever writes the checks gets what they want. Mm-hmm. And if you're going to have the state pay for something for everyone universally, it has to meet the needs of everyone universally. And when you talk about meeting universal needs and you're talking about teaching, then it's going to be the lowest common denominator, and we're meeting the most basic needs. Mm-hmm. And on top of that, you add in the political power of a teachers union in a state, especially in a state like California. And then you have a competing incentive of what will make the teachers happy. And what makes the teachers happy is more real income. And by that, it could either be more pay or less work, right? Either way, it ends up being sort of more money in their pockets. And also sort of a reduction of accountability for performance. There's so many things that are going on, and then obviously the cries of racism, which I think, honestly, to be fair to all the people who consider themselves out warriors for justice, I believe that if there is systemic racism in this country, it's in K-12. That's where it is. So because we continuously disenfranchise, or we just basically create conditions that make learning nearly impossible in places where learning, if you privatize it, and I'm not arguing for that necessarily, because I'm very conflicted on the school choice movement, so I'm not even to go there, but I am conflicted on that, that if you were to privatize it, like if you had there were stupendously well-educated African Americans who came out of segregated schools that were run by other African Americans. And I'm not saying we should go back to segregation. That is not my argument here. I just want to make that clear. But my argument is that given the will and the motivation and the mission to do what's right, and given the resources, whatever those may be, even if they're limited, you can succeed. This mission can be successful. It's just a question of when everyone's beholden to the state, and the state wants a certain outcome. The state's going to get the outcome it wants, and it'll do it. Some people will say, it's like, what is it? Hanlon's razor, don't attribute to malice what can be explained by incompetence, right? Like, I don't know if everyone is just incredibly corrupt, if they're really, really ignorant. I mean, I'm talking about like the state DOE levels, Department of Ed levels, or even federal. Or if it's legitimately like, how can we disenfranchise everyone so we can
It almost feels by design. It really
is it by design?
Yeah.
And like, again, I lean on Hanlon's razor maybe a little too much. Maybe I'm trying to be too gracious. And I have seen that a lot in administration. I mean, like, really, they're just people are nest feathering. I mean, it's gross. You see it at the district levels of administration. It's just disgusting. You see all the nepotism and cronyism and the really fat contracts going to random people. You're like, why are we doing this? Once you like, again, looking under the hood is not good for your mental health as a teacher. So
yeah. No, I mean, that's where I always felt most confident is like you said, when the door closes and I'm, in my domain with the kids, that I can do something with, then that kind of makes it, at its best, it makes it worth it. So I wanted to, shift a little bit around discipline. So we've all seen these horrific videos of, teachers getting maced by their students. That was the most recent one. What did you see in that realm, and what do you think were the incentives that created that in your former position?
So in my, I'm just trying to frame this. So in my last school, in the distinguished school, kids just did what they want, right? So they had their phones out if they wanted to. I remember, I think the cell phone addiction is a real problem. I think people underestimate how powerful dopamine is, especially when you tie that into the fact that these kids feel relatively incompetent at pretty much everything in their lives. They're not good at school. They're not good at reading. They're not good at math. Socially, it's terrifying now because bullying is ever present 24/7 if you have social media, if you have a phone. And so I think that the fear of the modern school system engenders the need for the escape of the dopamine hit, right? And so like, you know, as long as the kids are quietly looking at their phones or quietly, you know, using their VPNs on their one-to-one school-issued devices, most teachers are just going to sit back and not worry about it. Now, when you have kids who are violent or dangerous, now I don't, like at my old school, there's lots of notable stories. I only ever felt unsafe once, and that was early in my career with a kid who had actually was convicted of a pretty serious crime, but he was still at our school. And he and I reached a level of mutual respect, where he was safe and I was safe, but you know, that kid was beyond where I could go. But then in more recent years, what happened in around 2013, 2014, I had two colleagues at my old school, the one I quit to go to the distinguished school, my older, like, ghetto school, right? And we noticed that, like, behavior standards weren't being implemented at all. Like, we'd send kids to the office and they'd just get sent right back, and we'd be like, what happened? And they'd be like, nothing, I just sat there. Or, you know, we'd have detention, kids wouldn't go. At my last school, the distinguished school, we had kids with literally hundreds of detentions, and the principal decided to just forgive them all, to give everyone a fresh start. Like that, like hundreds of detentions.
Wow.
But the school before, so we looked, my friend was actually the union, he was like high up in the union, and he's like, that's it, I'm reading the contract. So he read the contract. He's like, oh, we have the right to form a discipline committee. And so he asked me and this other crotchety old man teacher who I love to this day, wonderful man. I was always worried he was going to have a heart attack in staff meetings because his face would go red. He'd get so angry at everything they were saying. But he's fine. He's living his best life now, retired. But anyway, so he said, let's form a discipline committee. And we could. And so we did. And all of a sudden, teachers started sharing with us all these things that were happening in their classrooms and how they'd gone through the protocol of, you know, notifying parents and writing it up on Aries or Power School or wherever and sending home this and notifying the principal, and the kids were not getting any consequences. And so we had this discipline committee, and we're like, okay, well, the union contract says that we can hold administration accountable, blah, 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 right? So we're thinking we have some power here. We're so dumb. We're so naive. And so we had these monthly meetings. And we'd just get nothing but run around. Just run around. Oh, yes, we'll change that. Oh, we'll look into that. Oh, we'll do this. Oh, we'll create OCS. We'll create blah, 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 blah. Nothing ever happened. I took minutes. I distributed things. I was meeting with teachers all the time, you know, and we just realized, eventually we just realized, oh, this is how it is now. And nothing's ever going to happen. I found out later that was a result of, you know, and not to impugn this president's character particularly, because they all deserve it, but President Obama's sort of move away from, I have actually the quote, it said, you know, there was a new policy, we wanted restorative discipline measures to keep kids in classrooms because that was supposedly going to make it better, even though there's another, 36 kids in my class who are being harmed by this person's presence in my class, but whatever. Then, so the quote was, and here's what my administrators were responding to, and this is what I'm talking about with perverse incentives. The policy warned that schools could face federal investigations if their statistics showed a disparate impact for certain races. Now, here's the thing. Where this is going to, I don't know how to couch this stuff. This is the problem with being honest. Where are the schools going to be most dependent on federal monies? Well, the schools that primarily serve the poorest kids. And as we know, statistically, the poorest kids tend to be children of color, right? So blacks and Hispanics, right? So we're telling these principals who run these schools that they can't have disproportionate suspensions or expulsions of children of color. Well, here's the problem. At my last school, it was like, I want to say like 85% Hispanic.
So I'm sorry. Are they? Yeah. So they were holding them to a proportional to the broader context of the country, when in fact the minority students were concentrated.
If you had a disproportion, you had to proportionately expel and suspend kids. Well, that either means you have to suspend more of the minority kids, or like when I say minority, at my school I mean white and Asian kids.
Right.
Or you have to suspend fewer brown kids. Well, you can't randomly choose an Asian kid because, he had a bad day and he was a jerk to a teacher and be like, oh, you're suspended so we can get our numbers up. Like,
this is equity in practice. This is what people have to realize. Yeah.
No one's going to do that. No one's doing that. No administrator in his right mind is doing that. So what do? They just go, okay, we need to find alternate consequences for the kids who are the offenders.
Right.
And those tended to be some kind of restorative practice. At my old school now, there is a Zen room, and literally they send kids into it, and it regularly gets destroyed.
Okay.
So the kids go into the Zen room so they can sort of have a timeout and calm down, and they go in there and they tag it, graffiti it, wreck the chairs, blow things up. No one set fire to it yet, which I think is good, but it's not restoring children to society the way it's meant to. So yeah, these are issues that came up in my other school. They basically just my quote unquote distinguished school. One of my favorite stories, because on Twitter there's a lot of teachers who are very upset about cell phones, and rightly so, totally understandably, because it's insane what teachers are having to deal with in typical schools. And my favorite story was at my old school. A kid got caught with his phone. Teacher, being a decent human being, is like, you're not supposed to have it. I'm taking it. Takes the phone, takes it to the office. Okay, now the parent comes to pick it up. Okay, and the parent takes a look at the phone and goes, this screen wasn't broken this morning. And it's been in your care all day. And the school turned around and told the teacher he was responsible for replacing the phone. The kid got a brand new phone. The teacher out of the teacher's pocket. And it quickly went around the school that don't confiscate phones. It's not worth your time. Like, that happened.
Yeah,
I think
right.
that was 2 years ago. So no one's taking phones away. And then, obviously, there's some attendant issues with that. Cheating's a real problem. The phone, actually, at my old school wasn't a huge problem, except that because my kids all figured out how to get VPNs within 2 or 3 years of having their devices. So a lot of them were just, watching whatever they wanted, whenever they wanted, on their school-issued laptops. So this is how it is now. And I think what we need, to go back to the circle all the way back to that original question: paper, pencils, lecture, real books, not digital.
Yep.
And going back to very simple standards and saying, this is the knowledge you will have when you leave, and you will have done these certain exercises to demonstrate that you have said knowledge, whether that's essay writing, test taking, whatever projects you want them to do. I mean, I think you just go back to basics.
And, but doesn't this sound like the banking model of education, where the kids, we're putting things in their heads, and this is all so traditional and terrible? Could you sense my quotes?
I mean, you're not doing a very good steel manning job right now.
I know. Well, no, actually, you're right. I'm gonna be better. I'm gonna say, okay. What would you say to the legitimate concern that this is not creative enough? This is not student centered enough. This model of education that you're using is not teaching the kids the skills they need to adapt to evolving circumstances in the economy, and that this knowledge base that they're going to have won't, be relevant. We don't know what will be relevant. That's why we need to teach them the skills. What do you say to that?
I would say that I have a wonderful example that a colleague that I work with, who is a brilliant art teacher. And this person knows so much about art, and so much about the periods in art and the concepts and skills necessary for art and how it was done by different people, that she is very clear with the students. You cannot break rules effectively until you know them. You cannot create until you know what's come before. You cannot solve a problem that is new if you don't know how the problems of old were solved. You can't. And this idea that you can just Google everything and then put it all together is laughable on its face. Give the kids a complex problem and say, okay, you're free to use Google to try to solve this. They will come up with asinine, ridiculous ideas because they don't know those ideas have been tried. They just don't know, and they don't know the outcomes. And when you start saying, okay, well, that actually was tried, and this is great you can do this in history. There's all kinds of things like in history that you can do this with. My favorite being communism, which is always hilarious. Like the kids go, well, why don't we just do this, right? Well, let's look at how that worked out over multiple time periods and multiple countries and multiple cultures, because human nature is human nature, right? So you give them a complex problem, and it takes them, they can't even begin to generate a solution or even an understanding of the problem, because they don't know enough to understand what's at stake in the problem, the components of the problem, right? They have to have the knowledge to take something apart before they can put something new together, right? So it's the question of it's like, what is it, Zen and the art of motorcycle maintenance, right? Like you have to take the engine apart to see how it works, and then to look at it and go, what's wrong with it? And then put it back together. And you may have to put it back together multiple times, but you already had that model, right? So you're learning the model before you can do something new. And in building something new, and this is what I grew up with a contractor. So, and he hated school. In fact, he didn't graduate. He went surfing instead. He was like, I don't need to go to finals. I'm going to go surfing. The surf is good. And I was like, and he told me that story, and I laughed. But he's brilliant. My dad's brilliant. And he has always reverse engineered things. But you have to start somewhere, right? And move backwards from it. So you can't just go, I'm just going to creatively come up with something because I'm creative. Well, in order to create, you have to know what came before. Otherwise, you're not creating, you're repeating. And probably doing it poorly. You're going to make a poor facsimile of what someone else already did well. Whereas you could learn from the masters and then stand on the shoulders of giants instead. But you can't do that without knowledge.
All right.
I don't know if I answered that well enough.
I think you did. I think you did pretty well.
Okay.
I think we got it. What did you see with some of the new teachers that were coming in when they're asked to do some things and present curricula a certain way, or do practices, or get a professional development, or how do they make sense of all of these things that are pushing down on them, or in that whole context?
I think in general, most teachers are good-hearted people. They care about kids. They want to make a difference. And it takes several years before they're completely crushed by the system. They come in all, hot and bothered. They're going to teach kids, and it's going to be amazing. And it's going to be like, I'm going to age myself here, but that Michelle Pfeiffer movie where she goes into the ghetto school and she gives them Dylan Thomas and they love her. And it's going to be, oh, Captain, my Captain. And it's going to be Freedom Writers. And I'm going to be Jaime Escalante. And they all have seen these Hollywood movies. Oh, by the way, little note on those Hollywood movies. Almost every single one of those teachers they made a movie about, quit almost immediately after they gained some notoriety. Yeah, the Freedom Writers lady lasted, I think, about 4 or 5 years in the classroom before she went to, she went on to a college to teach education at a college. The Michelle Pfeiffer lady only lasted a few years at her school. And again, it's not because of the kids. It's because of the system, right? The kids responded. I think those movies are accurate in terms of the response of the students. I mean, it might be a little overblown, but I remember my students loved me, and they loved that I believed in them. They didn't love me because they didn't know me, but they loved that I believed in them and that I trusted them, and that I treated them as though they were worthy of greatness and that they had greatness inside them. And I think that's what those movies are about, because that's what Jaime Escalante did too, right? But the problem is that you get ground under the wheels of this millstone. And there's all these a million persnickety little requirements. And the other thing is, it's really easy to be discouraged, because when you go to teacher, I'll never forget. Oh my God, I forgot about the story. When I was preparing for this interview, I'm going to tell you the story. You're going to love it. So I was at my old school, the ghetto school. I met this girl on the first day, and she was a dancer, and she was an English teacher. And I remember her literally twirling in the courtyard as she was talking to me, because she was just made that impression on me. And she goes, I remember you. And I was like, what? I've never met you before, because I would remember you because you're amazing and beautiful. And she said, no, I remember you from our school, because we were in the ed program together, but you were in a different section of it. But we had a couple of classes together. And I was like, oh, really? And that was all she said. And we didn't become friends. It took us a couple years to really become really good friends. And she finally spilled the beans. And she said, I remember you because I remember, and I'm going to censor myself, what a witch I thought you were. Because in our methods class, it was methods of teaching English. In our methods class, the professor who was a teacher, she wasn't a teacher. She was one of these like PD people. But she would occasionally go to the local district and do a model lesson. Everyone would fete her. And, oh, that was amazing. You're so amazing, right? And so I had been teaching at the worst school I taught at, which was a really tough school, the one I told you about, the convict who I had in my 9th grade English class. Anyway, that school, the teacher, I was young. I was like 20, I think 19, or I was probably 20. And I said, I went into the methods class, and she gives us this beautiful lesson, and it was based on The House on Mango Street, which is a wonderful book for, Chicano students. And she said, now, if you just do this and this and this, these kids will respond this way. And I raised my hand, and I was completely disingenuous in this question. I was like, well, what if they don't read? And she goes, well, try this. And I literally had, because I do research. Like, I'm good at reading. So when the kids didn't read, I was like, let me find a way to help them read. So I was like looking. And I'd never been trained. Here's the thing. Secondary school, you don't get training in reading at all. Almost zero, right? So you don't know how to help these kids. And so I asked her, and she said, well, do this. And I said, I tried that. It doesn't work. Can you give me something else? So she gives me like a second thing. And I said, no, I've done that too. That didn't work. And then it was like a third, and this is why my dancer friend is in the room, and she's like, why are you bothering her? You're being so mean. Like, basically that was her attitude. Like, I was being mean to her. And then she said, she goes, well, what about this? And I said, no, I've done that too. And I've done this, and I've done this, and I've done this. Is there anything else you have that you could offer to me? And she's like, if you just do what I tell you, it'll all work out fine. And that was the professor. And I realized, okay, don't push her any further, right? This is before I'd fully developed. I'd fully grown the wings of my oppositional defiance disorder, so I didn't push back on her at that point. But my friend told me, she's like, I remembered what a witch I thought you were, and now I totally understand why you were asking those questions. Because my friend had interned in a wealthy white school, and I had interned in the poorest, hardest school in our area. And so that's sort of the problem is you come into school and you have all these highfalutin ideas as what you're going to do, and you're going to help these kids, and your heart's in the right place. And I'll even say that about the sort of diversity, equity, inclusion types that are all about justice. They just want a better world for these kids, and then they realize they are not equipped to give these kids what they actually need. And on top of that, when they try to get that equipment, the system's going to stand in their way. And so what do? Well, you go with the flow. You take the path of least resistance. You accept in California, very generous paycheck they give you for doing this work. And you leave at 3 o'clock when the bell rings. And that's it.
Wow. And you said yourself, it took you, 14 years?
God, I think my fury sustained me at what I saw was happening to my students. My fury sustained the first, probably 10 years of my teaching career. I could tell you all kinds of stories about what I saw those kids go through. I will not, because we only have 12 minutes left. I want to make sure you cover everything you want to cover.
I got a couple, but yeah.
I will say that it is every bit as bad as everyone says, and and I'll tell you again, I'm going to say this for all the parents, because I think I'm going to assume here that a lot of the parents listening to this, or teachers that are listening to this, are kind of have their heads above water a little bit to even be able to seek something like this out. So even if you're in one of these upper middle class suburban schools where you think the kids are doing just fine, I would challenge you to look at how well they're writing, and really dig down and question them when you're talking about something they were supposed to have read. And when they turn in a PowerPoint project, which we assign altogether too many of in public schools these days, that you really look at the quality of their sentence structure, that you look at the quality of their ideas, and you give them solid feedback, because that is the only way these kids grow. And if that's one thing you can do, it is giving real constructive feedback about, and if it's kids that you think would be overwhelmed by feedback, give them just one thing to work on, and then try to teach them a little lesson that will help them work on that. That's like one actionable thing you can do if you're here and you're worried and you're like, how am I going to go forward in this career? Take those little steps and do what you can for the kids in your room this year, knowing that the kids in your room next year will be different and have different needs, but you can take little steps and do good things still.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, makes sense. I mean, I urge all the parents I talk to, find out what your child knows. Don't trust the grade. The grade says nothing. Good advice. I wanted to say, you touched on the house, just had a thought, the house on Mango Street. You said it was a good book for Chicano students. Where do you stand on the idea of representation in education? Do you think that it is salutary, or do you think that how do you feel about that? Do you think that it's important?
I think that here's the problem. The first part of this is, and I definitely like to harangue people about this. What's a Mexican? I mean, are you a Mexican from Oaxaca? Are you a Mexican from Baja? Are you a Mexican who's wealthy and had a bodyguard in Mexico DF? Or are you someone whose parents are barely literate and you're living with your uncle in Oakland because your parents were able to get you out of the country? Like, what's a Mexican? What's a for that matter, what's a Latino? And what does it mean to be black in America? I mean, which black? Chicago black? Nashville black? I mean, how can you say, well, this Sandra Cisneros book is written for Mexicans or it's written for Hispanics? Like, that's a really broad and I think actually rude assumption to make that every kid will understand this. We had a disaster on our hands at my last school. Every kid was told over the summer to read a book called Enrique's Journey about this young man named Enrique who came from Mexico as an undocumented immigrant. And everyone was supposed to understand Enrique's journey so they could better understand, because our school, as many schools are in California, was experiencing a pretty significant declining enrollment, which has continued. I would argue largely because of the economic realities of living where we live, but also because the quality of the schools is so bad that anybody with money is pulling their kids and putting them in private or some other option. And so we were getting, and this was in response to that, and it was the year before I went to that school, because we were getting more Hispanic students. And so the white administrator's response was, everyone should read Enrique's Journey. That will help us understand. And I'm like, okay, first of all, the Hispanic kids you're getting are not immigrants. They are kids like second, third generation. They speak English. This is a foreign story to them. This is not their story necessarily. I mean, yes, of course, there might have been a few kids who would have grokked it, but the typical kid was not like, oh yes, I am an undocumented. I mean, this is the kind of ridiculous nonsense you get when people want to diminish culture to, oh, we have to check a box for the Latino book, or we have to check a box for the black book, or we have to check a box, rather than saying, we're Americans, this is what our culture is built on. And even reading books about like the Chinese experience in building the Transcontinental Railroad in the Western United States, that's an American experience.
Yeah.
Right? So why do we have to say, oh, well, you're Latino, so we have to make sure we read a Latino book? Like, it's just stupid, and I think it diminishes cultures, and it diminishes the individual. And I think what's great about great literature is it doesn't matter where you come from. You can see yourself in the book. Not because of color, but because of the human experiences and the humanity that you see shared or reflected in a well-written character.
Yeah, that's very interesting. So, and it makes me think back to what you were saying about the student who knows baseball, who has a knowledge base for baseball, can read about baseball, can read something about baseball. Is it that the representation is just not specific enough or is it that it could be good, but it's this sort of like abstract big bucket that doesn't actually connect with, the detailed reality? Or is it something that we shouldn't worry about too much because, like you say, with the great works of literature, with some help and sort of guidance, they can relate to those characters?
Yeah, and I think like if you look at something like Toni Morrison, I mean, like if you can't see yourself, I mean, and obviously this is, well, I'll just say it. If you can't see yourself in her books, or you can't sympathize with what her characters experience, there's something wrong with you.
I know.
There's something wrong with you. Like, you're missing something in your humanity. Like,
right.
Like,
it's a great book. I mean,
what's great about books like The Bluest Eye, or Invisible Man, or Giants of the Earth, these sort of like quote unquote ethnic books, right? Drinking game. I said quote unquote again. If like you're reading these books, it's not about the ethnicity, it's about the shared humanity. It's about the struggle of life on Earth. It's about what it means to be good / evil. What are the nuances in good and evil? I mean, they're huge questions everyone sees on a daily basis. There's no reason that you should say, well, you're white, so you can't understand Ralph Ellison.
Right.
Screw you.
Right.
Don't you
if
dare
I was to
tell
say
my son
I
that.
identify with the protagonist of Invisible Man, what would that say? What is that? That's kind of an outrage, right? I can't identify with him, right? How dare I?
Some people might say that. I would say that was Ralph Ellison's whole point.
Yeah.
Why did he write that book? Because he wanted people to understand. I will never forget, and I know that it's touchy to say this. When I read Native Son the first time by Richard Wright, I was really struck by how Wright explained sort of, and again, I don't want to generalize, but to see a black experience that I had not understood. But he also makes it clear that we share humanity. We're the same. It doesn't matter what color we are. I mean, we're all going to face different struggles, but to put it on a level that my students would understand, or that would be immediately recognizable to my students, like, why is Eminem Marshall Mathers, why is he accepted as a rapper, right? I mean, obviously his talent, but largely because his rap is good because he has some shared experiences and shared humanity with other artists, right? And that's why I loved 8 Mile. 8 Mile was about him translating his reality into a world that didn't accept him, and crossing that divide, Right. So the reason great literature is great is because it speaks to something innate in us, in our humanity, and to say that we don't have a shared humanity because our color of our skin is different is so polarizing and so disingenuous and so dangerous and so harmful to children. It's so harmful to children to think that, well, I'm different, I'm brown, and so I will always be victimized, and I have no agency. And so I think, and this is where my tinfoil hat goes on, right, where that's like, okay, so what we're really trying to do is teach them an external locus of control so that they will lean on someone else. They will be dependent always on the government to protect, equip, feed, care for everything. And because only the government could be neutral enough, which is laughable on its face, could be neutral enough to take care of me, whereas I can't take care of myself because some, boogeyman in a white sheet is going to prevent me from having a family and succeeding. So, I know that, I wonder if this talk is going to get me labeled racist. This will be interesting to see what happens on Twitter after this, but
yeah,
but
well,
it is what it is
let it
at
rip.
this point. It's fine, yeah.
Yeah, and I think these are just ways that I think elites and groups of people who have a vested interest in controlling other groups of people they're not there sitting there rubbing their hands together, but they are latching onto certain narratives that will perpetuate a system of dependency, whether it's one or the other.
I'd like to point out too that a lot of these people making these decisions are part of they're the apparat class. So we're talking about apparatchiks who they have boxes to check, and so okay, how do I check this box, right? Because what they are first and foremost is compliant and conformist, and they do what they're told. And so they have a list of boxes to check, and they're checking boxes. And they're like, okay, how do we get Latino inclusion? Oh, I know, let's put in the national curriculum House on Mango Street, right? It's just a lot of it is just unthinking. How do I complete this task so I can maintain my position that I have in the state apparat? right? So like, I don't think that is said often enough, that a lot of this is not necessarily forwarding agenda as much as it is self-protective, right? Like, I'm trying to create something where I'm just trying to do what I'm told so that it looks on the surface to someone who has very little knowledge. So basically everyone in the government can say, we did a thing, right? And I think that should be spoken of a little bit more often, because I do think most administrators believe they're doing what's good. Most Department of Ed people and PhDs, EDDs think they're doing good, and they're doing quote unquote the work. See, I did quote unquote again. You guys are going to be really wrecked at the end of this. Sorry. Okay.
I'm going to watch this over with a drink in my hand, so I'll
Okay,
get all the
sorry,
drinks
don't
in.
do that.
Because
Don't
no,
do
it's
that.
fine. I can't do it live, but you know.
Okay.
I wanted to wrap up with a question. So as you know, our organization, Terra Firma, you know, we exist to support teachers like you. So if you think about, if you imagine your ideal organization, that what are there things that Terra Firma can do beyond what we're doing now, or maybe do it better, to help teachers in circumstances like the ones you were faced with? So,
Okay. So I think
I mean,
the first.
or you know, just your outside of that, just what do you think teachers need?
Well, I love that in your mission statement, or like sort of you said why, you know, you're risen to 12. I can't say French. I don't speak French. Well, I pretend I do, and I can't. But your reason for being, right, is that you are also going to help with professional development that's not BS, right? So I think that one of the things that we can do is give a macro view of education, or one thing that you could do. And then I would say that you should curate a list of books for teachers who are questioning the system and want to do what they can to provide a good education, and sort of they have the foundation, the philosophical foundation for what works and what doesn't, and why what works and why what doesn't. And without getting into the weeds of, on day one, make sure the kids see you in a tie, you know, like that crap, like, but like more of like the broad global view of what education could be, and sort of like the brightest minds, and also a historical view of what education was and why it went the way that it did, although that might be a little too weedy at first. I think just maybe the philosophical view of what are we trying to do and how do we best do it, and here are some great books on that you can give you some ideas that you might be able to apply without giving specific, here's a lesson plan and here's a structure for your class. And then the other thing, what else would I say? You know, I think you're already doing it, but like putting information out there that is on a more daily level of what practices can be implemented in the classroom that encourage intellectual standards or virtues. So like curiosity, grit or fortitude, right? And you know, and like questioning and pushing back, like not necessarily speaking truth to power, because that can get you in trouble in a public school, but asking questions and continuing to ask questions. And I think that if you can give people specific direction about things they can do both in the classroom and then in professional development or when meeting with an administrator, how can you handle these touchy situations so that they have a hard time branding you a bad guy, a dissident, as I have self-branded. Yeah.
And I think you give some great examples of that. This is a shameless plug, but in our Substack, ethical educator, .substack.com, you have an article in it talking about how you do that with an administration which has sort of put a target on your back for some of the things that you're talking about. And I think, you know, people check it out because it's exactly that, and we definitely want to do more of that. I think when you talk about you know, getting in the weeds, I think it's important to have this sort of intellectual tradition, which I didn't know anything about, and none of my education told me about this, but it was all like Rousseau and Dewey and Freire, and you know, there's an entirely different parallel around education and educational theory, which is, you know, much better in my opinion, actually aligned to what I wound up stumbling upon just because it happened to work. I'm like you, I tried everything. I tried all the, the faddish approaches. And when I gave up, the only thing left was, okay, how did I learn something when I was in school? And I'm going to do it that way, and we're going to see if that works because this isn't working.
Yeah.
But then I discovered after that there was this intellectual tradition, and now I'm reading that, and I'm learning even so much more from that. So, people that you would recommend, some of those names you've mentioned, who could we include in that intellectual tradition?
I think, they're all tricky because the sort of overwhelming gravity is towards these, like, I guess you call them constructivists. If I'm using that word wrong, I'm sure someone will yell at me in the YouTube comments. That's fine, or on Twitter. Feel free to yell at me. I need to be educated on this. But this idea that, like, oh, we're just here to facilitate the child's development or their becoming of whatever they're meant to become, which I actually kind of agree with. But I think the way you do that is by building a strong foundation so the kids can, decide who they're going to become, right? You can't just decide it in a vacuum. Like, you have to figure that out. So, like, my favorite people, if there's teachers listening to this right now, I think my first stop would be to find a couple of John Taylor Gatto's essays online. And my favorite one is Against School. That one's great. And then the second one is probably The 7-Lesson Teacher. That's a little longer. But they're both brilliant essays. And he basically talks about what is actually happening in school. He names it, which is brilliant. Because when I found that essay, I probably found them quite a while ago, I was like, oh my God, someone's finally broken it down for me. And it was such a feeling of relief to have sort of this older, and he was New York Teacher of the Year like twice. I mean, the guy was brilliant. And he writes brilliantly. I think that if you want something in the classroom, I will point you into a very weird direction, which is a man named Daniel Coyle. And sorry, you've got some background. You've got some background noise.
Oh,
Sorry,
I've got a little myself. That's no problem.
Yeah. No, but so Daniel Coyle wrote a book called The Talent Code, which is really supposed to be about coaching athletes. And it is excellent advice for teachers. If you take what Coyle talks about in The Talent Code and you apply, it's the only book I recommend to colleagues now. Unless they're like unless they want like more of like a how did we get here kind of discussion. I'm like, look, if you just want to be better in the classroom, please read The Talent Code. It's short, it's quick, it's brilliant. I would even argue you could go straight to the chapter. There's a chapter that talks about John Wooden. I always forget his name. How do you forget John Wooden's name? That's embarrassing. But John Wooden, two teachers from Hawaii. I have a history in Hawaii, but I was supposed to. I'll leave that out. Anyway, two teachers from Hawaii. Hawaii schools are notoriously bad. And so these teachers were establishing the Kamehameha schools, which are special schools for people of Hawaiian descent, right? And they wanted great schools. And they're like, we can't figure this out. How do we get great schools? So they wrote a grant and said, hey, can we just go watch John Wooden coach? Now, I kind of wonder if this wasn't just a little bit of fanboying, but these two men they got a grant, they went to UCLA, and they watched Wooden coach, and they watched what he did to make great players. And obviously we can't reproduce everything that Wooden was able to do because he had I think 4 or 5 hour practices every day, so I can't do that in a typical, high school setting. But the things that he did well are brilliant and amazing, and these teachers were like, we could do this in the classroom. We can make that happen in the classroom. So I strongly recommend that book. And then the only other one, and also I would like to recommend a definite super leftist. I love him. I love his honesty. I disagree with him often on Twitter, even though I have not yet engaged with him because he's like a giant to me and I'm afraid of him a little bit. But Alfie Kohn wrote a brilliant book called Punished by Rewards, and it is worth thinking about. Now, is it pragmatic in a typical public school setting? What he recommends is he basically says grades are bad. And rewarding kids for extrinsic rewards are bad. And I completely agree with him, and it flies in the face of all current behavioral practices in public schools because we're all on the MTSS pyramid. All of you teachers listening will know what I'm talking about of how we the tiers of intervention and all this crap. But he basically is like, look, it can't be education can't be extrinsically motivated. It has to be intrinsically motivated. And his arguments are brilliant. He's quite intelligent. He's a good writer. And even if you were like, I don't like these liberal ideas, you need to read Alfie Kohn because he makes excellent points. And I think it's worth thinking about. At the very least, we should be having a national discussion about what the hell do grades mean? What does an A mean? What does a D mean? And how do we calibrate that so that a grade is actual real information rather than just some bullcrap thing you bribe a teacher with Starbucks cards to get, right? So like, how do we, I think Alfie Kohn is the beginning point to that discussion. I think you have to read his book, Punished by Rewards.
Definitely sounds good. That's quite a list. And, I
only gave you 3.
Well, it says like, I feel like you said some other ones before, but
no, only
yeah,
3.
Yeah. Okay. Well, 3's a lot, for for busy teachers. I mean, come on.
Yeah.
So if I just start there, I'm in good shape, and then I'll come back to you with more because we got to have you back on.
I can make a list of that if you want, and you can always. And I'm happy to come back anytime you guys want me to. And I just. Oh wait, I can't leave this off.
Okay.
If you are a dying teacher, if you are miserable and burned out and sad, and this is not what you wanted for your life, but you are stuck, you have golden handcuffs firmly attached, okay, I want you to find Richard Mitchell, who was a professor at a New Jersey university. His nickname is the Underground Grammarian, and he started his writing career. You guys are going to love this. He started his writing career by taking the memos of administration from the college he worked at and dissecting their stupidity. You just be like, this word doesn't mean what do you think? And he's hilarious and erudite, and he's the most beautiful writer. I would put him in my list of top 5 most beautiful writers. He is a amazing writer. And so you can find his stuff, if you just Google the Underground Grammarian, you'll find someone who basically made a fan page to him and uploaded all of his old newsletters. But he has 2 books that I think are incredibly important, and maybe that's the starting point if you want to read summer reading. You won't be popular with your girlfriends at charcuterie night, but you can read 2 books by him. One is called The Graves of Academe, and so he basically lays out. I think he did this in the early 70s. I don't even know. No, it's not that long ago. It's probably later than that. The Graves of Academe, which is like everything that's wrong with school, and he's brilliant. And the second one is called The Gift of Fire, and it's about what it means to be a great teacher. And Mitchell is he is every bit a realist. He knows everything that's wrong, and he's going to give you a push and say, it's okay, you can keep going. It's going to be hard, but you can keep going. And basically the tacit message is, we desperately need you to keep going. And it's a beautifully written book, and he never talks down to you. He's not patronizing. I randomly found his name in a comment board on some random economics article, and I am so glad I found it. I'm forever grateful to that anonymous poster who said, read Richard Mitchell, you'll love him. And I have absolutely loved him. So if you need some heartening, if you need some strength, go find The Gift of Fire. And if you have the stomach for it, read The Graves of Academe too.
And we, with the teacher shortage and the good teachers being forced out, it's so important that we keep them in the fight and teaching. So please visit tfteach.org and, fill out the form and submit it to us. And we'd love to have you in our meetings too, because we can offer a lot of support there. As far as books go, you ever read Barry Garelick as a math teacher? He's hilarious. He has a book called Out on Good Behavior, which is a tradition. Imagine the most crotchety voice, but hilarious, like a hilarious writer. That's something I would definitely add to the list. And we can add all these links to the YouTube when we're done with the stream. And I know. Oh wow, we've gone 15 minutes over, but you know what?
Sorry. It's
totally great. It's been great, and Dissident Teacher, it's so great to have you on. I'm going to tell all our viewers about your thing and your things and where you can be found. You can be found on Twitter as Educated and Free. Mm-hmm. And please check out her Substack, Educated and Free, at Educated and Free.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but if
if
you're listening to this and you're a teacher, and I mean, if you want to spew hate at me, I guess that's fair. But if you need help, or you just want someone to encourage you, or if you need like specific help with a lesson, I know this sounds dumb, but I'm happy to help you. And maybe my ideas aren't perfect or great, but if you just need someone to talk to, I will listen to you. I am there. It's not like my family needs me or I have small children. It's fine. But seriously, please reach out if you're struggling. There are other teachers who believe and we just want what's best for kids. And it's not ideological. It's just giving them the foundation so that they can live happy, successful lives, however they define that. However those kids define happiness and success. That's all I want for kids. And I'm sure that's what almost everyone listening wants for kids too.
Absolutely. And that's educatedandfree.substack.com. And thank you so much. Terra Firma also has its own Substack, The Ethical Educator, which is our platform for teacher experiences and insights. And you can read Dissident Teacher on that platform as well. She has an article called Speak of the Devil, which is terrific. And so, also please visit our website, tfteach.org, to learn about our services and explore our teaching resources. Thank you so much, everyone. And we're going to have you back to talk about like the other 3 hours of stuff we didn't get to. So thank you.
Anytime.
Yeah,
Anytime.
Thank you. And thank you, everyone, for listening.
Thank you, guys. Have a great night. Well, thank you.